We are joined on this episode by a very talented film critic and entertainment writer who started out writing horror reviews for her own website, The Blogging Banshee. And now her work can be seen in genre staples like Fangoria, Dread Central, and Nightmarish Conjurings. She currently has her own column, Uterus Horror, over at Certified Forgotten. And soon you'll be able to check out her contributions to the upcoming book, Queer Horror, a Film Guide, which we'll get into more later. But first, welcome to the show, Molly.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, very glad to have you here and talk about this book and much, much more. But before we get to all that, we typically start off by going all the way back to the beginning with guests. We ask them, what first gave you the bug, be it genre, be it writing, be it film? What got you interested in it? Was there a person? Was there an experience? Was there a particular movie maybe that got you hooked?
Yeah, so for me, kind of my horror origin goes back to when I was 4 years old. So a long time ago. But I have a much older sister who was babysitting me at the time and decided to make me watch Nightmare on Elm Street with her, which was a very traumatizing time in my life. But also it kind of was the initial spark that got me really interested in horror. And that became one of my favorite film franchises. And obviously Wes Craven was someone who definitely kindled and ignited my love of horror throughout the years as well. And then later in life, I'm the kind of person that will annoy my partner watching a movie where I'll say, oh, I bet this is what's going to happen. And unfortunately, far too often, I usually am right. But because of that, he initially had said that I should actually start writing movies. And while I didn't feel comfortable doing that at that point, I did decide that maybe I would start writing reviews. And so that was what led to the creation of my website, The Blogging Banshee. And that was almost 10 years ago now. So it's been a pretty long time that I've kind of started my writing career and branched out from doing reviews to doing more editorial type stuff and think pieces and columns and things like that, as well as diving into fiction as well. I've written a few short stories. I'm in the process of writing my first fiction novel as well. So just all these different facets of horror that I love that I'm trying to get my hand in as many different things as possible.
Now, you mentioned liking horror from a young age, but were you also writing? Did you go to school for any kind of creative writing, or did you have a whole different major in mind?
What's funny is my undergrad major was actually in archaeology, which is very specialized, obviously, and very specific. And what actually kind of made me move away from that was one of the last classes I took before graduating was taught by a graduate student, a PhD student. And he said the unemployment rate for archaeology graduates was astronomical. I don't even remember the specific percentage, but it was insanely high. And so that made me think, maybe I probably shouldn't get into that profession. So I would say within a year of me starting writing my website, I ended up deciding to get a master's degree, and I did that in professional creative writing. And that's kind of where I started moving more into fiction work as well as doing nonfiction and entertainment writing.
I wanted to dive into a little bit more of the background of when you started The Blogging Banshee. Were you reading some other blogs at the time, and were you inspired by those? You mentioned that your love and the kind of penchant for predicting the outcome of movies kind of helped you realize like, oh, I could write about these. But kind of what were your intentions when you first started out with the site?
I think I was obviously familiar with places like Fangoria and Bloody Disgusting and things like that. But beyond that, I didn't really do much reading. I think one of the things that really made me want to start my website was because horror is, everyone who loves horror knows that it's often very much looked down upon compared to other genres. And at the time when I started, there also weren't necessarily a ton of women writing about horror. There obviously were some, and they're like some of those people I'm friends with now that have been writing for even longer than I have, that have always championed the genre. But it still was something that I kind of wanted to lend my voice to, and also lend it as, don't know the best way to put this, not as not stuffy, I don't want to say not professional, because at this point I do consider myself a professional, but just not
pretentious.
Yeah, not as pretentious, and kind of more from the point of view of someone who, yes, I can be critical of these films, but I can also say, even if it's even if I give it a 5 out of 10, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not an enjoyable film. It's not fun to watch. It just, it might not be as well made as some other films. So I kind of try to bridge that gap. And I also noticed that a lot of film criticism, especially around horror, and especially when it's from someone who isn't necessarily a fan of the genre, there's a lot of snark and negativity around those reviews. So even on films that I give a 1 star or a 1 out of 10, I usually still try to focus on the positive things, the things that worked about it. And I always try to emphasize, even if this film didn't work for me, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't watch it because it might be a film that you end up loving. So I try to be critical while positive at the same time, because I think that's something that even today is a little bit lacking in film criticism.
Yeah, no doubt. The snark is, it almost overtook all of the internet. But
yeah.
I do want to say congrats, Blogging Banshee, coming up on a 10-year anniversary. The entertainment business, film, the world itself has changed plenty over that decade. But how would you say your perspective on entertainment writing has shifted since you first started?
That's a great question. I think that I still am very dedicated to it, but it also is something that feels a lot more like work than it used to. And it's not necessarily because of the writing itself. It's more because we're seeing a lot more emphasis on influencer culture and like TikTok and YouTube videos and things that aren't the written word that are being emphasized more and getting more access to these films than traditional film critics. So it's definitely work, but it's something that I am still dedicated to and passionate about. So I still want to contribute my voice to that. But it's a little disheartening to see that the written word isn't as important as it used to be.
And I do see on your Instagram, you do a little bit of the, I see you talking about like 10 movies that I loved or like 5 books that were awesome. So I've seen you start to do a little bit of that. Do you enjoy some of that, or does it just feel like you have to do it to kind of keep up with the way things have changed in the landscape around covering the entertainment industry, whether it be written or video form?
Yeah, I'd say it's a little bit of both. I do feel that in order to get my opinions out there to a wider audience, I do kind of force myself to do more video content. But I will admit I'm horrible at it. There's some people who are like full-time content creators on TikTok and stuff, and I applaud them because I just don't have the energy for it. But I would say when I'm doing those, I typically enjoy doing those types of lists. I think doing the lists are more fun because it's not necessarily something that I would write about as much, except for at the end of every year, I usually do my favorite horror films and shows of the year. But other than that, I don't write as many list related things. So I usually reserve that for the video content, which I don't mind doing as much. But I do find myself kind of having to force myself to do the video for reviews, and I'll usually really distill it and have it be as bare bones as possible to try to encourage people to actually read the full review to get more in-depth analysis. Whether or not that works, I don't know, but it's just kind of the name of the game and trying to get your content seen by as many eyes and using as many modes of social media as possible to do that, even if that means doing videos.
Well, I know I have definitely added some books to my list because of your videos, so I appreciate you. So, kind of going back to, blogging, how did you end up transitioning from that to writing for other sites like Fangoria and Dread Central, et cetera?
That, I think my kind of foray into writing for other people started, it was either 2018 or 2019. So it was a while after I'd already been writing for my own website. And it kind of got to the point where I had been, to a certain extent, in the industry for a long time. And for my own website, I don't make any money off of that. It's just kind of a passion project. And so it got to the point where I was like, you know what, maybe I should actually start pitching to these outlets that will pay me for my writing. And that kind of led to me pitching to places like Fangoria and Dread Central and getting connected with more people that way. And I will admit that's also something I'm horrible at pitching. Even when I have ideas, I am one of the worst at actually sending pitches to outlets to see if they'd be interested. It usually just ends up sitting in my brain and dying at some point. But I try, and it's been great. Like all my experiences with these different outlets for 99% of the time have been really positive experiences. And I've been able to connect with a lot of other editors and film critics and things that have just been very encouraging and nurturing and supportive of my work, which is great. Because I feel like horror is weirdly one of the few. I know a lot of people don't like the term community, but I'm going to use it in this context. The horror community, I feel like, is one of the few that is a lot more supportive of the different people involved in a lot of other genres. There are always going to be outliers that are very loud that aren't that way. But for the most part, I have had overwhelmingly positive experiences, whether it be with the people that I'm working with or just people that I've interacted with talking about horror on social media and stuff like that.
You said something that probably perked up Becky's ears as well as mine, but you have a really wild pitch in your head that everybody has declined, but you're like, I know this is gold if someone would just take a chance. I'm just curious if you have a really out there horror idea.
I don't know if it's necessarily wild, but there's one that I've really wanted to do that I think I've honestly only pitched to one place, so I probably should pitch it to other places. But it's just, I've noticed there's been a lot of horror recently that revolves around older people as the villains, like in X. And I thought that was a very interesting thing and kind of has a lot of layers to this kind of innate fear of getting old and becoming feeble. So that's something that I like I said, I pitched a variation of that idea to one place and I never heard back. So that's something that eventually when I develop it more, I might pitch other places. And actually recently I had pitched something. I actually think this was a pitch that I had sent somewhere about 3 years ago, maybe less, but about. And then I saw just recently that they published an article by someone else that was basically the same topic. And I know that happens to people all the time in this industry, but I was just like, oh, okay. I guess you guys didn't want me, but that's okay.
Oh, yeah. I think that happens to everybody in some form of creative writing, whether it's like, film journalism concepts, or if it's like a movie you wrote that you're like, what? I swear they were reading my script on my computer. Sometimes it's great minds think alike, but you always hope that it's not because they took your pitch, but didn't give you credit. So let's hope that's not the case. Speaking of kind of interesting like pitches and topics, I want to talk a little bit about your column at Certified Forgotten. So what does uterus horror mean, and what made you want to write monthly on that subject?
Yeah, so the basic definition that we've kind of worked on for uterus horror is that it's a subgenre of films that focuses on the experience of growing up with a female gender expression. We do use that term because that does include people who are non-binary, but may be more on the femme side. That also includes people who are transgender. And these are films that capture the act of becoming an adult or coming into your sexuality using horror as a way to emphasize and or act as a metaphor for those experiences. So some of the really common ones that come to mind, or popular ones, I should say, that come to mind for that are films like Carrie, Jennifer's Body, Ginger Snaps, Raw, things like that. And the initial idea for that column actually came from a meme on Twitter, funnily enough. It was the one that was going around for a while where it was the lunch tables where it would group different movies at each table and you would have to pick which one you would sit at. And there was one that did that where the three films that were grouped at a table were actually Ginger Snaps, Jennifer's Body, and Carrie. And kind of two things happened in my mind when I saw that. One, I was like, that's my table. I want to sit there. but also it made me realize the connective tissue between those films. And it made me also realize the similarities between other films like it. And it was something that people weren't really talking about a lot. I know a lot of people equate them to just like coming of age stories, which they are that. But I also feel like historically coming of age stories are about men becoming boys. So I wanted something that kind of differentiated it from that. It's not those stories that are the most common that you're going to see. So it initially was a Fangoria column, and then it moved to Certified Forgotten. And since then, it's been great. Monthly just kind of made sense. Just one, because there are so many. The more I wrote about it, the more I realized there are so many films that fit into this weird little subgenre. But also, I just from a uterus standpoint, it also made sense to do monthly. if you catch my drift,
get it.
Obviously, it doesn't always happen monthly, just because my schedule sometimes, if there's film festival stuff going on or travel or whatever, or even with my editors, if there's stuff going on with them, sometimes it gets a little messed up, but usually it's once every month. Yeah.
So, what would you say has maybe been the most rewarding thing or maybe the coolest opportunity you have come across during this writing career you've had about horror? Have you gotten any kind of boons about set visits or any kind of cool gifts in the mail just from it? Anything in particular?
Honestly, there's been so much. 'Cause I am a person who always has imposter syndrome. So even though I've been doing this for a long time now, I always feel like I shouldn't be. So anytime anything exciting happens, it's a big deal for me. But I'd say some of the highlights are the first time I had a work published in a book, which was a personal essay I did for Hear a Scream Volume 2. Which was a big deal for me because one, it was the first time that I had actually seen my writing published in book form, which was very exciting for me. But also because it was one of the most personal things that I've ever written. I know personal is in the name, personal essay, but it's things that I normally would have been too nervous to talk about in depth. So that was a big deal for me. And it was a very exciting time. And I think honestly, the Queer Horror Film Guide is also a huge deal for me because that's something that I involved a lot more writing and a lot more dedication, a lot more work on my part. And so being able to be part of that and to be able to talk about queer horror, because again, kind of going into the imposter syndrome, I interchangeably use bisexual, pansexual, queer to describe myself. Just any of those apply. I don't really care. But because of that, and because I am in a relationship with a man, so from the outside, it's just a heterosexual relationship. I always feel like I'm not queer enough to take up queer spaces. So the fact that I was even allowed to work on this project was kind of a big deal for me, and it was very exciting. But yeah, so probably those two things. And honestly, just my uterus horror column, I'm so proud of that. And the editors over at Certified Forgotten have been amazing, and they're so supportive, and they work with me a lot through my chronic illnesses and mental health stuff that sometimes gets in the way of my writing. And they've always been very gracious during that as well. So being able to work with them has been a dream.
Yeah, shout out to the Mats over there. We've had Mr. Donato on this very program before. You naturally kind of pivoted to the book, which is kind of a big reason we wanted to talk to you on this anyway. So I want to chat more about you co-authoring Queer Horror Film Guide. So we're in a world now, where Shudder has released like the Queer for Fear doc and the Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street. And a lot of people, with hindsight, looking back at the 80s and seeing how much stuff was kind of hidden in plain sight and things like that. But I want to ask you initially, how did you get involved first with this book?
Yeah, so initially it was one of the co-editors of the book, Tyler Dupay, who reached out to me just to see if it would be a project that I would be interested in working on. And from there, I had a meeting with the other co-editor, Sean Adley, who kind of was the one who initially started this project, and had kind of an informal talk with him over Zoom. And then I basically did a sample entry, which ended up getting into the book. And once I did that, and they kind of vetted me and made sure that I was the right fit for it, which I'm very grateful to both of them for taking the time with me and trusting me to be part of this. And then from there, there was a huge list of queer horror films, and it was one that was ever growing because, of course, even today, there are so many new queer horror films coming out. And we would just constantly try to whittle through that list, and we would sign ourselves up for different films. And I think as it stands, there are over 900 films included in the book. It is very massive. And again, that's not including the many queer horror films that have come out since then. But it was a really great project. I know Sean and Tyler wrote a significant amount of the entries, and then myself and the other co-authors did a minimum of 50 films for the book as well. So it was definitely a very long, laborious process, but the fact that we're so close to the finish line and having the physical book in hand is very exciting.
Yeah, that is a lot of content to cover. That's crazy. So can you share a little bit more about your particular contributions, or maybe any specific subjects that you tackled? It sounds like you had maybe 50 different films that you looked at, but were there any common themes among what you covered, or anything that you maybe divided and conquered with some of the other authors around certain subjects that you all had kind of a preference for?
Yeah, I think for the most part, we just kind of picked the films that we were interested in. And then obviously there would be some that we were less interested in that we just kind of picked those up as needed. I will say quite a few of the ones that I ended up writing about, just because I was one of two women who were writing on the book, I did focus a little bit more on the ones that had lesbian, bisexual, pansexual representation, but I definitely branched out. There wasn't necessarily any one specific area that I focused on. It was just a lot of picking the books that I loved. The first entry that I did that was my sample entry that ended up getting to the book. I did the 2018 Suspiria, which is one of my favorite horror films. I am obsessed with that. And I even got to write about some that kind of canonically have become queer. For example, one of the early ones I did was I got to write about Alien, which is another one of my favorite films, which because of one little thing that was included in Aliens, it made it so Alien was in fact a canonically queer film. So that was very exciting to be able to write about that one. And for the most part, we tried really hard to focus on ones that were more overtly queer. There are some that are more historical films that lean more into subtext. But for the most part, we tried to focus on the ones that had clear queer representation in them. Some exceptions to that, one that I had to fight a little bit to get included in the book that I got to write about was The Old Dark House, because it's a 1932 film. Obviously, there's not going to be anything that's overtly queer in that, but there are a lot of elements in that make it a very, very queer film, especially for the time. And the fact that it was directed by James Whale, who was an openly queer man, also, I thought, warranted inclusion in the book. And luckily, after discussing it a bit with Sean, he agreed with me and I was able to have it in the book. But yeah, it was kind of all over the place. We focused a lot on films that we loved and films that interested us. And in the book, at the end of each entry, you'll know who wrote it because it'll have the writer's initials on it. And there's also going to be an index at the end that has each of our names and then all the films that we covered listed under it, which I think is nice as well, because everyone has a little bit different writing style, obviously, even though we try to include all the relevant information. So each entry will have the title, the year it came out, the writers, directors, the main cast, things like that. And then we'll go into synopsis and analysis. But some of us might have more serious entries. Some of them might be a little bit more cheeky. So it's kind of nice to have those initials at the end of each one so you get a feel for each writer's style. And I also think by having so many different styles and different tones with it, it makes it, even though it is a reference book, it makes it a little bit more fun to read, at least in my opinion. I think it makes it more fun.
Yeah, it sounds like it has a lot of personality, not just pure analysis. Do you have any specific lesser known queer movies that you want to call out or recommend to people, maybe regardless of if they're covered in the book or not?
Yeah, there were actually quite a few films that I ended up writing about that I had never heard of, never seen before signing on to this project. One that I really loved was The Wolves of Cromer, which was a 1998 film that kind of equated werewolves to the AIDS epidemic, which I thought was a really interesting way to do that. And it was a really kind of understated film, but very interesting. Good Manners is one that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, but I had never heard of it at the time that I fell in love with. Obviously, I have a thing for werewolf films now that I realize that both those films are werewolf ones. But even just I also got to write about some of the films that my friends were involved with. I got to write about Mohawk, which Ted Gagan worked on. And I actually got to write about The Pale Door, which I'm sure will be familiar to both of you. Nice. So it was really interesting to be able to do that and look at a lot of these films in a bit of a different light and kind of focus not just on the story, but on the queer content in them. Because some of the queer content might be fleeting, but it still is important representation.
No, we appreciate both the shout out to our movie. I happened to just finally meet Ted Gagan in person at Fantasia, which I know you covered remotely this year. But I want to pivot just a little bit and just ask you personally, why do you think horror is such a great genre to explore LGBTQIA plus themes?
That is a really good question. I think horror has always been a genre that's on the margins. And so a lot of the themes and the characters that involved are also people who are kind of on the fringes of society, so to speak. So a lot of the people who are weird in some way, whether they be neurodivergent, or they're into goth culture, or if they're queer, it's something that kind of is a home and safe haven for a lot of those people. And obviously, in a lot of earlier films, there wasn't necessarily great queer representation. There's that whole trope of bury your gays, which we see time and time again in horror films. But I think because there has been such a deep love of the horror and the camp of a lot of these films in the queer community, I think we're seeing a lot more films coming out, especially within the past 5-10 years, that are more geared towards queer stories. And I just think horror is so unique in the fact that it can blend so many different genres together. So it's not necessarily all serious or all scary. You also get a lot of funny stuff, and you get interesting social commentary. And that's, people always say horror is political, which is very true. Every horror in some way or another is political. But I also think horror is very queer. In some way, it always has been, even if the people making the films didn't realize that at the time. And I think more recent films are just showing how true that is. And I also think that because horror is queer and horror is political, it's so uniquely positioned to use elements of horror and the supernatural and things like that to tell stories in a way that's more accessible to all audiences. The Wolves of Cromer is a great example because it has these young gay men who are represented as werewolves and shunned by the community, when in reality, it's meant to represent the AIDS epidemic. And I think that's a really interesting way to kind of contextualize that for people who might not be part of that community, might not really understand it as much. So I think horror is so unique in that way, that it can do so many different things and tell so many different stories in ways that no other genre can.
No, here, we agree.
Yeah, it was one of the most articulate answers to that question I've heard in a minute. So good work, Molly. Lastly, the last part of the formal interview, do you have any advice for others that are pursuing a career as a film critic or a creative writer, or maybe advice for other folks that want to explore queerness in horror?
Yeah, I mean, from the writing standpoint, I would say be better than me about pitching, because that's one of the best ways to get your voice out there, is just pitch as many ideas to as many outlets as you can. But even if you do that and you're not getting a lot of traction, there are so many different websites and things that you can use now to post your work, whether it be WordPress or some other outlet. If you have something to say, it doesn't necessarily need to be at one of these bigger outlets. You can create your own space and build from that. And by showing your passion, it's going to give you more opportunities elsewhere. So don't let the pitch process discourage you. Even very seasoned writers who have been doing this for a long time, who are well known, still get rejections. It's the name of the game. Also, unlike myself, don't let your imposter syndrome discourage you. If you have a voice, you have something to say, as long as you're not being cruel in any way. I always like to specify that, especially since earlier we were talking about kind of the snark that's been in a lot of stuff. You can do it that way, but I think that you're going to find a lot more people drawn to your work if you talk about horror and what you love about it, rather than focusing on what you hate about it.
Good life advice in general. I think they're focusing on the things you love and trying to lift, other people up. Definitely, I think will pay off in the long run.
No, very much agreed. But yes, thank you for those answers. Again, like Becky said, very articulate answers. So take that, imposter syndrome, on Molly's behalf. But we're going to jump into the second segment here, which we do with all guests. We call it the Rapid Fire 15. It's neither rapid or really fire. It is 15 questions, though. One of those things where we say it's not a cool test. There's no points. However, we just want you to kind of give the first answer that comes to mind. And it's really about just letting the listeners know a little more about your tastes and what you're into. So they've already learned a good bit, and we've kind of tried to tailor this toward what we know about you. So if all that sounds good, we will jump in.
Sounds good. I'm ready. I am a very indecisive person, but I'm ready.
I think you're going to be okay here. We might know the answers to a couple just from the interview, but starting off with question one, we always first ask, what movie do you think you have seen the most in your life?
Oh, okay. So if we're talking non-horror, it is definitely Labyrinth. That is my favorite movie of all time. I've seen it so many times I can recite the entire film as I'm watching it. But horror, that's a little bit tougher because there are some that I watch by myself a lot, but then there are others that I watch with my partner a lot. I'm going to say it's probably either Scream or Ginger Snaps. It's hard to say which one, but I would guess it's one of those two.
Nice. And for any answer, you don't need to keep it to horror. You can answer, we've gotten things anywhere from like Titanic to, I don't know, like 10 Things I Hate About You. So you can go wherever you need to go. But we will have some specific horror questions for sure. All right. Question 2. Is there a movie or a song that always makes you emotional, makes you cry?
Oh, yes. The most recent film that is one that I fell in love with that makes me cry all the time is actually Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Another one of my favorite films of all time. Absolutely beautiful. I sob every single time that I watch it. It's not pretty.
Aw.
It's a good one.
It's so good.
Is it just the ending that gets you when she's watching her later?
It usually starts around the time that they leave the islands, and then it just gets really bad by that point.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. No spoilers. If you haven't seen it, I believe that's still on Hulu, but it's out there. It's a movie certainly worth watching.
Yeah.
Number 3, you may have answered this clearly since you were 4 years old, but we're going to ask anyway. What is the very first film that scared you, stuck with you, gave you nightmares? Maybe if not Freddy Krueger, was there something in its wake that also really affected you for the years after?
Yeah, that definitely was my first foray into horror, the first thing that really absolutely terrified me. But I will give a different answer because this is a film that I saw, again, probably way too young. I'm not entirely sure when, but it's one that even today has affected the way I do my daily life. And that is actually Poltergeist 3, weirdly enough. Because of that movie, I have a very strong hatred of mirrors. I don't like having mirrors in my house, if they're in the bathroom, whatever. But even when I've gone house hunting, if it's a house that has like the mirrored closet doors, I refuse. I will not buy it. I will. It's a thing for me. And it's entirely because of Poltergeist 3.
Wow. So you must like a fun house of mirrors is like your absolute nightmare then.
I think in that case, it wouldn't be quite as bad just because it's like more of a fun, supposed to be spooky setting. But if it's in like a house or even a hotel room I'm staying at, I don't want it there when I'm sleeping. I don't want to wake up in the night and see something in the mirror that shouldn't be there.
Fair enough. Horror movies, Poltergeist specifically, but horror movies in general have trained us that something is always going to be in the mirror. So totally understandable. All right. Question 4. What is your favorite horror movie franchise?
Oh, see, this is a tough one. There's so many good ones out there. You know what? I'm going to have to go with the Ginger Snaps franchise, not only because I love it, but I also feel like it's a franchise that doesn't get enough love. If people have seen it, they usually have only seen the first one. And I think the second one is equally as good as the first one, just in a very different way. And the third, which is technically a prequel, is very different, but I also think that it is great and has some really funny moments that I absolutely love.
I think that's the first time someone has given that answer, and that makes me really happy.
Yay!
Yeah. It's not bad to say, Scream and Nightmare like a lot of people do, but it's always good to hear somebody come with an alternative one. Question number 5. What is your favorite horror movie subgenre?
Okay, I won't say uterus horror for this one, since that's the obvious answer. I really love paranormal horror, like more leaning into ghosts. For some reason, that is the subgenre that has always terrified me the most. And I am very much a believer in ghosts. I've had a couple of weird ghostly experiences over the years, and for some reason, it just always has scared me more than anything else. I like human slashers and stuff. They don't scare me. But if there's a ghost, it's probably going to scare me, which also ends up kind of bleeding over into found footage a little bit. For me, one of the scariest films is Hell House LLC, and it's perfect combination of those two things. But definitely paranormal ghost horror is probably my favorite.
Thought you were going to say werewolves based on your responses earlier.
It's true. I do love them, but man, it's just there's something about being scared by a ghost that gets me every time.
Yeah, I find there's usually like 2 types of people, like horror fans are either scared by supernatural stuff, or it's the complete opposite where they're scared by things that are more grounded in reality, like Home Invasion. So
Mhm.
I'm more of the Home Invasion person. The ghost stuff doesn't scare me. All right. Next question. What is your favorite horror novel?
Oh, this is a great question. Most recently, it would actually have to be The Reformatory by Tanana Reeve. I absolutely adore that book, not only because it has really great supernatural horror in it, but I think it's also a really important snapshot of US history that a lot of people aren't as familiar with. I had never heard of places like reformatories, so it was really fascinating to read something that's rooted in reality, but again, kind of with Uterus horror, using the horror elements to exacerbate a lot of, like, make a lot of the things more intense. That's definitely The Reformatory. And it's one that I love so much that I forced my mom and my dad both to read it, and they even both loved it, which is a rarity.
Nice. I'm gonna have to add that to my queue. I do not. Becky, have you read that one?
No, I'm not familiar
Yeah.
with
Okay.
it.
Yeah. Me neither. That'll be on my Amazon cart tonight.
It's great. She's one of my favorite authors. She's absolutely amazing.
Question 7. Who is your favorite horror author? That's a shoot. That really was what I was asking next.
I mean, obviously Tanana Reeve is up there, but I would probably say, oh man, there are so many good ones. I would say it's between Tanana Reeve and maybe very different side, a little bit less serious, but Grady Hendrix. I think both of them are great, where Tanana Reeve does a lot of things that are more socio-political, as well as having either supernatural elements or creatures and things like that. I love that side of it. But then kind of for more like the spooky, fun, lighthearted stuff, I love Grady Hendrix too. Especially, I think my favorite of his is probably Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. So it's just very different sides of the horror coin, but they're both amazing.
All right, now we're going to switch gears a little bit. So if you were taking an out-of-towner around Portland to show them, where all the good stuff is, where would you go? Maybe some restaurants or parks or bars? Where would you take someone to show them a good time in Portland?
Oh, see, I'm still kind of a tourist here myself. So in terms of restaurants, I probably honestly don't know the best places, because I've technically only lived in Portland proper for a month and a half-ish at this point. But places that I love, Powell's Books is obviously a big one. Anyone who's familiar with Portland knows that. But the main location, which is a literal city block with multiple stories, can be a little bit overwhelming. So I would actually probably take them to the smaller Powell's, which is in a neighborhood called Hawthorne. It's a little bit more low key, a little bit more accessible, and still has a really great collection of books. And then for the movie lovers, Hollywood Theater is definitely a great location to go. It's a beautiful historic theater. They always have really fun screenings of current films, and then they also do fun screenings of older ones. They sometimes even do the kinds of screenings that have like the live music performance. We saw Suspiria there with Goblin performing the score live a year or two ago, which was amazing. And then another movie related place is Movie Madness, which is a rental place, but it also has its own little private screening theater in there. It's very small. I think it only fits like 15 to 20 people, something like that. But then they also have a lot of really awesome memorabilia. So all along the outside, it's almost like a rental place within a museum. So it kind of has a little bit of everything there, which is so fun. And they even do classes. So if you are a film buff, there's fun classes that you can take there. And then if you want something more outdoorsy, the Rose Garden is not only beautiful by itself because of the roses and stuff, but it also kind of sits high up. So you get an amazing view of basically all of Portland on a clear day. And it's so beautiful and lots of fun walking paths around there and stuff if you want to do something that's not in a movie theater or bookstore.
Nice. I know you said you were recent to Portland, but you are a PNW person. Next question is, what is your favorite thing about living in and around the Pacific Northwest?
Oh, there are so many things. I've lived in some area of the Pacific Northwest most of my life. I mostly grew up in the Seattle area, but honestly, a lot of it is just the climate. I am a big fan of clouds and rain. I like to be wearing multiple layers. So I've been I'm a really big chunky sweater fan. So this climate is more conducive to that. Which is funny because I actually am originally a Southern California girl, but not anymore. It's just everything here is so, at least obviously closer to the coast that you are, but like Western Washington, Western Oregon, it's just so beautiful and green and lush. And also I'm like, honestly, Portland area and obviously some other of the big cities and Seattle and stuff politically also kind of more aligned with me than a lot of other places. But it's mostly just, I love this climate. I love this kind of weather. I like to feel cozy. And if I moved back to Southern California or something, I probably would never feel that again unless I kept the temperature in my house at 65 year round.
I'm as a former PNWer, I can definitely attest to all those things that you talked about. And I miss a lot of those things as well. And this time of year, I definitely miss the weather as well, because currently in Denver and it is 100 degrees today. So,
oh, geez.
Yeah. At least it's dry heat.
Yes, right. that is a benefit.
All right. Question 10. Do you consider yourself a cat or a dog person?
Oh, man, you're putting me on the spot too, because I have a dog on one side of me and a cat on the other. If I'm being honest with myself, I would probably say I'm ever so slightly more of a dog person if I really had to choose. But I also am just an animal person in general. Like, I'm trying to convince my partner that we need a bearded dragon. You know, like I have wanted many different types of animals in my life, but if I had to pick, just edges ever so slightly into dog territory.
Question 11. Do you have a favorite concert you've attended, or maybe just a memorable concert experience that sticks out to you?
Oh, that's another good one. I kind of have a three-way tie for my favorite concert experience. I guess I'll do them in order of when I saw them. So first is actually John Carpenter. I've actually seen him twice, but the second time that I saw him, my partner came with me. We actually flew over to San Francisco to see him perform there, and we got to do the whole like VIP, go backstage and meet him and get stuff signed. So that was amazing. And like every performance I've seen of his, he's amazing, which is insane given the fact that he's performing scores from his movies and given his age, but he's actually a really fantastic performer. Then probably St. Vincent was another one. I love that one because it was a very small, intimate venue, and it was literally just her performing. It was her on stage with her guitar performing all the music, which was amazing that she was able to do that all on her own, and she sounded absolutely incredible. And she's also probably one of the best live guitarists I've ever seen. And then more recently was actually Crosses, which was here in Portland. If anyone doesn't know Crosses, it's the lead singer is Chino from, I almost said Disturbed, from Deftones. Very different band. And that was another performance that was so cool. It was in a very small venue, and he's a great performer. And I weirdly have an affinity for performers who, like, I don't know how to say this other than they dance like dads, if that makes sense. Like John Carpenter danced like a dad when he was performing, and I feel like Chino dances like a dad when he's performing, which is such a weird way to describe it, but it makes their performances so much more fun and energetic and engaging. So it's a three-way tie between those ones.
Oh, those are all great. And I think I didn't realize this until now. I think we have a shared affinity for a lot of the same artists, Molly. So love. We'll have to talk more about that.
She means Disturbed.
I actually absolutely love Crosses, and I haven't seen them live yet, and I want to. And seeing John Carpenter live was also one of my favorites. And I know exactly what you mean by the dad dance that he does. He was just having the time of his life up there in the sunglasses with Cody. Yeah. It's adorable. I love it.
It's so precious. I love it.
It's so pure.
Yeah.
All right, another music-related one. I don't know if you're a karaoke person or not, but let's say you were. What would be your go-to karaoke song?
Okay, I've only done karaoke twice in my life, so I don't know if I necessarily have a designated song, but I'll just go with the song that was actually the song that I did the very first time I did karaoke, which was for a friend's birthday, and he forced me. I sang the Oogie Boogie song from Nightmare Before Christmas.
I've never seen someone do that song in karaoke.
Yeah. I was kind of surprised that they even had it as an option, to be honest. But I grew up a theater kid. So I very much I love doing very theatrical things like that. And I also really like to do voices. So singing that song and trying to emulate Oogie Boogie's voice was a very fun experience, especially given I had had a few drinks. But I don't know if I would do it again, but that definitely was a showstopper of a song.
Very nice. Similar related question. What would be Molly's walkout music? Say you were coming out for a TED Talk or you're coming out for the Fantastic Fights even, or maybe you're a ball player or something. What are you walking out to pump up the crowd?
Oh, wow. That is a really, really good question. That's tough. Because I feel like it would depend on if I wanted to do something that was more just like getting people hyped, if I would go something more like Megan Thee Stallion kind of vibes, or if I wanted to do something that was more me. And like, I honestly would probably end up doing a Crosses song, but I just don't know off the top of my head which one I would do. I'm going to say that it would 90% chance it would be a Crosses song. I don't know which one though, because there are so many good ones.
Bitches brew. I think a bitches brew for you.
There you go.
I do use that one a lot when I add music to like Instagram stories and stuff. So you're probably right.
Nice.
Love it. All right. Question 14. If you could program a double feature of any two films to kind of show the world who you are, so maybe you're two wolves, you're two werewolves, I don't know. What would be your double feature?
You know, surprisingly, I'm going to go in a little bit different of a direction than I even initially thought, because these are two films that I love, one that I grew up on and one that's a more recent favorite. And they're also ones that I think are weirdly similar, despite the very different content. So I actually would go Return to Oz and the 2018 Suspiria. Ooh. Which seems like a very out there selection, but there's some weird themes with like the idea of motherhood, and there's a lot of mirror stuff in both of them and witchcraft and stuff. So I just feel like and kind of an obsession with youth. I think that would make a really interesting but still fun double feature.
Nice. I would have never connected those two, but I get it now after hearing you talk about it. All right, we're almost there.
Almost
Sean,
there, yes.
we'll
Final question.
One.
Number 15, what would be your dream project? Be it a writing assignment, be it a screenplay, movie, even if you're directing. So basically, is there like an original idea? Is there something, a historical figure whose story you'd like to bring to life, or a particular angle you'd like to take? But long story short, what's Molly Henery's dream project?
Oh, man, I have ADHD, so I have so many different dreams. But I would say the biggest one right now is, and this is something that I've had in my mind for a long time. I've done a lot of the research already. I just need to actually get down to actually working on it. But I actually would like to actually finish a feature-length screenplay that I have in my head and actually have it made into a film. And it's one that's very loosely based on my distant relatives during like Prohibition era. And it would be very much horror though. So it's, like I said, very loosely based on that with horror elements. And if the vision that I have for it, I think if I could get someone like Axel Carolyn to direct it, that would be amazing, because I think that her style would very much fit what I have in my head for this film. But I have to actually write it. That's the tough part. But yeah, that would probably be my dream project, to actually get that screenplay finished and have it made with people in the industry that I know and like working with. So it's kind of like doing a fun project with friends.
I love that. I love that there's a personal connection too with your family background. And you know what you said about actually having to write it reminded me of a tweet I recently saw, which was the hardest part about writing a book is that you actually have to write the book. And it's so true. Just like getting it done is hard, but hopefully you'll find the creative space to make that dream a reality. But you did it. You made it through the rapid fire 15 and the formal interview. Great work. Excellent answers all around. So what's next for you? What are you working on? Anything you want to talk about that you have upcoming? Obviously, we'll talk about pre-ordering the book and all that, but is there any other projects that you have coming up?
Yeah, I mean, I always have the monthly uterus horror column on Certified Forgotten, and I am currently working on my first attempt at a horror fiction novel as well, which I have only a few chapters in, so that's something that probably is very well down the road if anything ever comes of that. But I think the next big thing that I have is for Queer Horror Film Guide, we are going to be having our first signing later this month on August 24th at Dark Delicacies in Burbank. So if people are in the area and want to come out and say hi, get a book and have it signed, we won't have all the authors there, but most of us will be there. So it should be a good time. I'm very excited. I love Burbank. I love Dark Del. So I'm happy that that's going to be our first signing, and don't have anything else official yet, but we will be trying to book out more signings and appearances and maybe host some queer horror screenings and things like that in the coming months. So that's something that if you want to follow me on social media or any of the other writers, that's something that we can kind of keep people updated on as they come.
Speaking of social media, we will put anything you mention here in the show notes down the road here for folks to find if they're following along. Where can people find you if you'd like to direct them to a social media? Are you active on any particular one?
I am active on far too many. I'd say you can find me on Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd just by looking at my name, Molly Henery. Just don't miss the extra E in my last name. And then on Twitter, you can find me on there as well, although I usually only post updates about my work, like writing and stuff. And on there, I am blogging Banshee.
Gotcha. And like I said, Queer Horror, a Film Guide can be pre-ordered now, or depending on when you're listening to this, you can just order it right now. But yes, the book Molly has co-authored. And again, show notes on this episode at paperstreetpodcast.com will have links to not just that, but everything she has mentioned, including where to find her and her blogs. I know you have a link tree. We'll make sure we link to that as well.
Awesome. Right, well, thank you again, Molly. It was a pleasure getting to know you a little bit better and learning about your perspective, especially on queer horror. So thanks again for taking the time to talk with us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It was awesome talking with you both.
No, agreed. And we thank you very much for the time. And again, check out paperstreetpodcast.com for all the links and to get this book.
Take care.
All right. Thank you.